A thin, amber vial rests on a mahogany desk, the liquid inside quivering like a nervous beetle pressed against the glass. The room is dim, a single bulb casting a warm pool of light that makes the amber glow pulse. You are the forensic analyst, fingers hovering over the vial, the same one that slipped unnoticed into a black coffee on the night of November 15, 1963. Within 6 hours, the consequences of that tiny dose will begin to surface in a way no one could predict. Frank Olson was not a number on a clipboard. He was a senior microbiologist at Fort Detrick, a man whose hands were steady enough to load petri dishes with the precision of a clockmaker. At home he was a husband to Eleanor, a schoolteacher whose mornings began with the scent of fresh soil from her garden and whose evenings often ended with her reciting every U.S. president in order, a habit that made dinner conversations linger on history. By 1962 he had entered Project Bluebird, the covert CIA program that would later be renamed MKUltra, under the meticulous supervision of Dr. Sidney Gottlieb. Gottlieb kept a battered notebook filled with handwritten entries, and his desk was always strewn with vintage jazz records whose crackle could be heard when he lifted the lid. These details anchor the story in the lives of real people, not abstract figures. It is late November, the air outside sharp and cold, and the lab's fluorescent lights hum above the rows of equipment. Gottlieb, his coat buttoned to the waist, moves with a steady rhythm, his footsteps echoing on the linoleum. He slides 10 milligrams of LSD from a tiny vial into the steaming cup of coffee that Olson has just poured, the powder dissolving into a swirl of pale amber. 10 milligrams is not a trip dose for a seasoned user, it is enough to flood the brain with serotonin, to scatter perception into shards, to blur the line between thought and hallucination. Why would the CIA give an experienced scientist a dose that could upend his reality? The next morning, the memo dated November 14, 1963, sits on a filing cabinet, its heading bold, Operation MKUltra, Need for Compulsive Memory Loss. The paper's edges are frayed, the ink slightly smudged, and beneath the typed words a signature reads. Gottlieb. The memo states, subject must be rendered incapable of recalling any classified material within 24 hours. The Technical Services Division logo, a stark emblem, is stamped in the lower right corner, the same insignia that later appears on a 1965 report discussing psychoactive agents in covert operations. The words on the page echo louder than any spoken warning. When the LSD takes hold, Olson's world tilts. In the conference hall, the fluorescent lights flicker, casting long shadows that stretch across the polished floor. He feels a cold sweat bead on his forehead, the taste of metal on his tongue, and a sudden rush of panic that makes his heart hammer like a drum. He bolts from the room, his shoes clacking on the tile, and rushes to a telephone mounted on the wall. The dial clicks as he pulls the receiver up, his voice a whisper edged with trembling. I can't work for them, he says to Eleanor at 11:30 p.m., they're making me a monster. Eleanor, clutching the soft blanket of their son, hears the crack in his words, the tremor in his breath. The phone log recovered from FBI archives shows the call lasted exactly 3 minutes and 42 seconds, each second ticking like a metronome in the silence of the night. The following morning, the building superintendent's voice cuts through the pre-dawn quiet as he reports hearing a thud at 8:17 a.m. The sound reverberates down the hallway, striking the polished marble of the lobby, then fading into a stunned hush. Olson's body has fallen from the 10th-floor Manhattan apartment, his form hitting the street with a sickening thud that sends a ripple through the surrounding glass storefronts. The window latch is found locked from the inside, a single rivet still in place, and a pattern of blood spatter traces a forward-moving trajectory that suggests a motion rather than a drop. If this were a suicide, the locked latch would be an odd detail, a puzzle piece that does not fit. In 1975, Admiral Thomas Moore, reviewing the case, writes that the death was a suicide. Yet a footnote on the same page, ink still fresh, reads, further verification of window mechanism required. The footnote is later crossed out, the crossing still vivid against the paper. That erasure hints at a reconsideration, a reluctance to let the official story stand unchallenged. What was found that made the agency uneasy enough to conceal it? Eleanor Olson, driven by grief and resolve, files a wrongful death lawsuit in 1976, demanding answers. The settlement in 1977 for $75,000 is recorded in court transcripts, where the government admits it is compensation for non-consensual participation in a classified experiment. The settlement forces the CIA to release over 400 pages of documents, including the original dosing protocol that lists a 10 mg threshold for severe disorientation. The agency's acknowledgement of liability emerges only after financial pressure, a fact that deepens the mystery without naming it. A new revelation surfaces in 2020 when a U.S. District Court revisits the case. Judge Karen Harris, her voice steady, notes, there remain serious doubts about the official narrative. She orders an independent forensic review of the window latch, the blood spatter, and the phone records. The sealed report, now unwrapped, concludes that the latch could not have been locked from the inside while a person fell. The conclusion shatters the long-standing claim of suicide, forcing us to ask how a false narrative could survive for decades without internal challenge. The pieces begin to align. The 1975 memo's aim, to erase memory, matches the observed psychotic break, while the forensic evidence contradicts the suicide scenario. The only coherent thread is that the CIA engineered a controlled accident to silence a subject who threatened to expose their methods. Newly declassified emails from Gottlieb, dated November 16, 1963, contain a single line, subject's death confirmed. Proceed with cover-up protocol. The cover-up protocol, outlined in a separate 1964 document, directs operatives to alter death certificates, pressure local press, and file false insurance claims. This terse email becomes the smoking gun linking the dosage, the contradictory forensic evidence, the legal settlement, and the 2020 court's doubts. The story now turns to a handwritten note tucked inside a 1971 CIA briefing titled, Project Starfish. Its ink, faded but legible, reads, Subject 42, Anomalous reaction, self-induced exposure. Recommend immediate termination of project and disposal of all related samples. The initials, JH, under the note matched the signature on the 1963 email that ordered the cover-up, tying the two documents together. Subject 42 is an internal code for scientists unknowingly recruited as volunteers for LSD-induced interrogation. April 19, 1971, a date that appears on a declassified log of a secret flight departing from Langley Air Force Base. The flight heads for a remote Alaskan outpost known as Site Cactus. The manifest lists 3 passengers, a CIA operative, a civilian chemist, and a military pilot. None appear in any public record. Yet those 3 individuals are the only ones ever documented as having handled the original batch of LSD administered to Olson back in 1953. The determination referenced in the Starfish note is not a bureaucratic wind-down but a directive to eliminate every trace of the drug, a process involving a clandestine incineration at the Alaskan site, and, crucially, the silencing of the chemist who began questioning the program's ethics. Testimony from a former Navy diver, later called before the 1975 Church Committee, confirms that a black bag cargo, later identified as a cache of LSD crystals, was dumped into a subglacial lake, an act recorded in internal archives as a final purge. The phrase, self-induced exposure, in the note implies the subject had taken the drug voluntarily, a scenario that could only exist if the subject already knew of the experiment, a fact the CIA's own internal memos deny, creating a stark contradiction. When the evidence is assembled, a clear picture emerges. Frank Olson's death was not a spontaneous suicide, nor a tragic mishap of an untested drug. It was the culmination of a deliberately orchestrated cover-up that stretched into the 1970s, involving the erasure not only of evidence but also of the very scientists who might have exposed the truth. The agency's extensive redactions, forged death certificates, and secret incinerations reveal a systematic effort to hide lethal mind control trials. The conclusion extends beyond one case. It demonstrates that MKULTRA's reach went beyond abstract research, it touched real families, real lives, and real concealments. It shows that the CIA was willing to manipulate forensic evidence and silence its own operatives to protect a secret program, even after the Cold War's end. If a single scientist could be erased from history, what other shadows are being quietly maintained in the vaults of power? The answer may still be out there, waiting for a diligent